So 5G4D has been going for nearly 5 years now, and I'm sure many of you will have missed some of the early interviews because you weren't there at the beginning. I mean, why would you have been? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release some classic episodes from some legends of the industry that you might have missed. And so I hope you enjoy these shows, and I hope you enjoy the brand new ones that come out every 2 weeks. So thank you for listening, and enjoy. Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is a titan in the world of wargames. Often cited as one of the greatest game designers in the world, he's credited with inventing the card-driven system in We the People, which has been an inspiration to gamers and designers alike. He's a professional historian, university professor and author. He is an expert in consultation and strategy and has advised the American government and has a CV that would take the whole show to recite. My guest this week is Mark Herman. Mark, welcome.
Good to see you, Ben.
And so, how difficult was it for you to pick the games?
You know, it was funny. You know, obviously, you'll do the conversation. I was very, very busy, but I was, when Uli Blenneman, who's a very good friend, who lives in Germany, if he lived near me, we'd play games every week. But great guy, and he said to me, you should contact you, and I did. And then when you sent I thought the idea of your show was so intriguing, and then you said you had 5 games. And so I have to admit that I spent a solid 10 minutes sitting in a chair looking at my bookshelves and picked the games. So how I picked the games was really more of what I play a lot, and which I know, and then maybe like one or... Then, of course, a 10 would have been easy. 5 became very hard. I guess that's the way to call it.
And so, You're a legend in the world of war games. Is it only war games that you play, or do you go into other areas of gaming?
Oh, no, I play everything. It's just that if I had my druthers, I would play war games most of the time. But it's interesting, I tend to end up playing, with groups of people. I'm not usually playing war games. The group games tend to be, my wife is a very big fan of the game Splendor. So, and so we play Splendor. I play, and of course, all these new Kickstarter games come out with all these cool minis. And I belong to a group run by a guy named a good friend named J.R. Tracy. And these things all cost I got the Kickstarter with all the special. It costs $150, $200, and I don't buy any of that stuff. But I get to play theirs. So I just play like Rising Sun, which I thought was quite good. And I played almost all the big games that you would name. I don't want to. One thing I won't do is I never knock another game. I'll say nice things about a game, but I won't knock another game. So I say nice things about Rising Sun. I played a lot of the Kickstarter stuff recently that I'm much less impressed with, but I'll leave it at that. And so if we go back to the start, when did you start gaming? How did games come into your life? Was this from childhood or was it later on? Well, the thing is that the first game that I've ever really took on in a big way was chess. And that's right. In fact, after I gave you the list, I realized, well, how was chess not on the list? So I think I list of 5 games, and I slipped my little magnetic set in my pocket. So that was the 6th game was chess. But I've been playing chess since I was 9, and a cousin taught me how to play, and that was sort of the only game I remember playing in a big way for a while. And then when I was 12, I ran across an Avalon Hill game called Battle of the Bulge. And I remember to this day, it was $4.95. I had to borrow money from my younger brother to purchase it. And that was my first war game. And then I was intrigued. And then it just that was it. That's what I've been doing since I was 12.
Was there no intimidation at the complexity of the rules? Or was that part of the adventure?
I guess, I'm 64 years old, so I can't really tell you what I remember happening at 12 years old, quite frankly. I remember that the one experience from the rule book is I learned what the word inclusive meant. I didn't, because it kept saying, set up these pieces from this hex to this hex inclusive, and so I had to go get a dictionary to learn the word inclusive. So that was my first word that wargaming taught me. And, but beyond that, no, it didn't bother me at all. I mean, and then and it was 2 copies of Battle of the Bulge at this little, card store. And as soon as my friend, Jimmy Dundalakis and Gary Gonzalez, played the game, the other set was gone. And, they bought the other set. So the 3 of us were playing Battle of the Bulge, on a regular basis after that, for that first year. That it was the only game I had.
And so what informed your... I guess what I want to ask is, did your love of history inform the kind of games you played, or did the games you play inform your love of history?
That's an interesting question. I guess, that's a chicken and egg question. I would say that I already was very interested in military history even before 12. So you may recall, so in 1960 was the centennial of the American Civil War. And American Heritage put out this really cool, large book on the American Civil War, and Bruce Catton did all the text in it. He's a very famous, Civil War historian, and it had these maps, which were little of all the battles. And every time I've talked to a gamer about my age, they all remember this book. And there were these maps that looked like war game maps of little soldiers, showing where in the, with the painting of the battlefield with where the units were, but as soldiers, almost like a miniatures game. And so and I was 6 years old when that happened. So, that really was what stirred my initial interest in military history, was the American Civil War, and the centennial being sort of, at 6 years old, you're sort of becoming knowledgeable that there's this world, and there are things all around, you even belong to a country. Those are the things you start to pick up around 6 years old. You've been in school a little while, you pledge allegiance to the flag, so all this stuff starts becoming more real to you, and so this centennial was a big deal at that time, and so that kind of got my interest. That's where it started, really. And so
when did design come into your mind? When did you think, I want to make these and not just play them?
Well, so after I got, I started playing, at 12, I started playing Battle of the Bulge, and then, then we found this, literally, it was, the old joke, we had to walk barefoot through the snow, but it was literally, as New York kids tend to grow up early, so we used to get on multiple buses to get to this store that sold other Avalon Hill games, and so very quickly we had Africa Corps and Battle, Panzer Blitz and Luftwaffe and all these games, and what happened was, all the games would have extra counters, so I started amassing this group of these light blue and light pink counters, if you remember the old Avalon Hill games. And then I got interested in this battle about, the Charge of the Light Brigade, which then is the Battle of Balaclava. So when I was about 12 years old, I designed a Battle of Balaclava game using the extra counters from, I got a piece of paper and I literally drew hexagons on it, the whole bit, and I put numbers on these blue and red counters, and I made a Battle of Balaclava game. So that was my first design, just a kid messing around kind of stuff.
And how long did it take you before you thought it was a viable thing, that it stopped being just a kid messing around with your spare counters to something that's, you can publish something that you wouldn't mind other people playing too?
Well, so that's really sort of the story of, how I got to SPI. So I was in college, I was getting a degree in biology and history, and the history degree was really kind of my main passion. And I was a war gamer, and I went to the first Origins, which was in Baltimore when I was, I guess, a sophomore, whenever the first Origins, I think I was a sophomore. Yeah, it just started, it was my first year at Stony Brook, so it was into my sophomore year, and I go to the first Origins, and I go by the SPI booth, and I say, hey, at this point you start to say, well, what am I going to do with my life? You're in college, and you sort of, and I was very big on trying to pay for myself, so I needed to get more, I always worked, but now I had to get a job, and I talked to the SPI guys, and they kind of gave me this, come down Friday nights and play test the games, and, we'll get to know you, and then, maybe there's some work. So I started coming down to SPI after that, through my junior and senior year. I wrote an article for Moose Magazine, which I was never published, but I did write an article, and I used to do some play testing for those guys. And then when I graduated college, I was literally working as a I was mowing lawns and cutting down trees. I mean, that's what I was, a tree guy for Bartlett Trees, and I'm doing that. And then I was a bill collector for a newspaper. And then at that point, I called up SPI and said, "Hey, is there any work there? This summer is coming to the end, and I kind of looking at the future." And the receptionist at SPI had just given his notice that day. So I became So in September 1st of 1976, I became the receptionist for SPI, and that's how I got into a game company. And within a month, I was designing games.
So your first game is one of yours, and you mentioned Uli before, and when I spoke to him, he lavished an incredible amount of praise on this game. And this game is Empire of the Sun. Why is this going to the cabin?
Empire of the Sun. So, I've always been fascinated with first off, one of the disadvantages of being an American is I only speak English, so it's one of those, it's an old joke, but the punchline is, if you only speak one language, you're American. So I can read a little German, I can read French a little bit, I can read Spanish a little bit, but ultimately I'm kind of stuck with English, and I became obviously very fascinated with the American Civil War. So my fascination has always been the wars of America, is really kind of the punchline of all that. And while the European War is very interesting, there's a million games on it, to me the Pacific was always the more interesting conflict. I always liked land, air, and sea things and all that. And so back in, I want to say 1985, I did Pacific War, which was this large game system to handle the whole war. But it's really an operational level game to fight out the Solomons and these various campaigns. And there's a strategic scenario to play out the war, but that was an add-on. The real game is an operational level game. And I remember when I was doing that game, I kept saying to myself, what I really want to do is I want to fight the war in an afternoon, not fight the campaign in an afternoon. And so time goes on, and now I have a full-time, I'm not a game designer full-time anymore. And I decided to do this topic, and there was something about, and I was using my card-driven system. I'd already invented the card-driven game system, and I wanted to do a card-driven game that was a traditional hex and counter game with cards. The card-driven system married onto a traditional, and somehow the blend of all that really, it's one of those games I really like to play. I know I like my own cooking, so I apologize for that, but it is just this game that I continually like to play. I'll play it I play it all the time, and they have these bots. In the second edition, I came up with these bots, and now we're improving them. So it's been nice to interact with the community of people that I've been playing this game with for, it came out in 2005, so 13 years now. We're still going strong. So it's kind of like the game I like to play the most.
And how do you feel that this game models the actual Pacific conflict, or is that even important that it's a simulation?
Well, first off, it is very important to me that the game be, have historical verisimilitude. So that's important to me. And a lot of traditional hex and counter guys will tell you that the cards make it a bad simulation. They'll tell you that. And what I would tell you, and I have a column, in C3I magazine where I talk about this. I think the problem that I have with a lot of war gamers is they only talk about kinetic history. In other words, the mechanics of, thing went from here to there and all that kind of stuff. But to me, that is not good history, because good history is psychological history also. So, for instance, if you look at an American Civil War game, this is one of my best examples. If you look at it from a kinetic point of view, you can see that you've got the Army of the Potomac in front of Washington, you've got the Army of Northern Virginia in front of Richmond, you've got fortresses in, all over the place, and you can quickly say to yourself that Washington cannot be captured. You can build it up to the point where it's just not going to happen, because you know the rules of the game, the numbers, it's not possible. However, if you read any history, and I have read, literally hundreds of volumes on the American Civil War, and you read, Lincoln's actual letters and the actual communications between the commanders and, the what they call the OR, which is the the records of the War of the Rebellion, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, you realize that Lincoln was always worried that Washington would fall. That was in his mind, with all the fortresses and the whole army. That bothered him. He worried about that all the time. So any game that doesn't have you as a Union player worried about Washington is not a good simulation. They would say, oh no, as long as I get the pieces on the board correctly, that's a good simulation. I'm saying, no, that is not a good simulation. A good simulation is as I, as a player, start to worry about the things that they worried about. Okay? So now, taking this forward to Empire of the Sun, so one of the biggest secrets of World War II was the atomic bomb. In fact, it was such a secret that when FDR dies and Truman becomes the president, 2 weeks, he's president for 2 weeks. And this guy Byrne, who was both in the Roosevelt administration, was a good friend of Truman's, and George Marshall, come into the president's office and said, there's something we want to tell you about. He didn't know there was an A-bomb, so there's a big secret, right? So when you play a Pacific game, you know there's going to be an A-bomb. In Empire of the Sun, there may be an A-bomb, because otherwise there's no reason to invade Okinawa. Why would you, once I have a bomber base within range of Japan, I just have to wait till the A-bomb shows up and I win the game. That is not how they played it in the real world. And so in the game, the psychological history is you're MacArthur, you're Nimitz, and you're a king, and you're trying to conquer Japan, and an invasion of Japan is always what's going to be the case. And then at the last minute, after Okinawa, and then everybody's going, that was a bloodbath, and oh my God, what's going to happen when we actually invade Japan? They go, oh, here's this A-bomb, here's this platinum bullet. Where did that come from? But there it is. And so that changed. So everything so you have to build a game to be a good simulation. The game has to put you in the role of, I'm invading Japan to win this war. And then, oh, by the way, oh, look at that. This thing showed up. How wonderful is that? And if you don't have that, then I don't think it's a simulation of the war at all. It's just a simulation of moving pieces around a board trying to get, to do what they did historically. That's a book, but that's not a game. That's not a simulation in my mind, because where's the psychology of the actual participants in that? And that's how I look at it. And I think Empire of the Sun captures that rather well. And, the kinetics, and people argue about this, that, or the other thing. But one of the things I learned from Jim Dunnigan is what a lot of people think is history is an inch deep. And when you actually get into the details, you start to find out that war gamers have a lot of myths about what is accurate. And I've had, classically, I've had discussions on the internet where somebody says the combat results table in For the People is a mess. It's a disaster, they write, all those things. And then I publish all the numbers and how I got there, and then the response you get back on the internet is, well, I don't agree. No other facts to come into the art. So I just gave up on that. So the answer is it a good simulation? I think so. Would that be a universally held view? No. But it doesn't matter. It's, at the end of the day, I think it's good, and I know I have good reasons why I think it is a good simulation, and those answers to anybody who doesn't agree with me are, just noise. They don't hear it, so it doesn't matter anyway. There's no discussion about who's right, who's wrong. It just says, this is what I think, this is what you think. The facts be damned. So there it is.
So you did a degree in biology and history, and then you moved on, and your master's was in a subject, if I'm honest, I didn't know existed up until researching for this show, but you did a master's in national security studies. What did that entail? Okay,
so national security. So, well, first off, why? Let me start off with why I got the degree, which is really, remember, I'm now at this point, I'm a father with 2 children. I'm married, obviously. It's to the same woman, by the way, after 40 years. So I want to say that's a good news story. But I was doing work for the U.S. government, and it used to be like the guy in charge of a project. It would be you had to have a master's degree or equivalent experience, which was 2 years. So if you had 8 years or more of experience, it was supposed to be 2 years for 1 year kind of thing. If you had 8 years of experience or more, you didn't need a master's degree. And then the government just decided one day to drop the equivalence thing. So now I'm running a fairly. I had like about. At one time, at the end of my career, I had like 6,000 people working for me. So when you have like that many people, and I couldn't be in charge of my own jobs, that would be a problem because I wouldn't have the right degree. So I actually went back to get my degree when I was 40 years old. I got it in 19. In fact, the diploma is right there. It's on the wall in this place. I got my degree when I was 41 or 42 years old. But the point of the degree was so I could basically be in charge of my own jobs. That's why I got the degree so late in life. But the degree is what they call a multidisciplinary degree. So national security studies is, first off, it's very much military history at its core. Two, it's a lot about, classical strategy texts, Sun Tzu and Clausewitz and all that kind of stuff. But then, the United States is a world power, and there is an enormous amount of, there's the United States Defense Act of 1949. I mean, there's a lot of details into budgets and how, all of the Title X rules. I mean, there's a whole lot of legal and bureaucratic complexity around it. So if you take military history and marry it with, American policy and law and budgetary things, that's what a national security studies degree is in.
And so are there any sort of common misconceptions that you hear people talk about with national security? Are there sort of conspiracy ideas that people have that you see and you think, really, in the real world, it's completely absurd?
Well, let me give you... so this is something I learned recently, and I believe it's true. So if it's fake news, I apologize. But John Kelly, who's the current chief of staff of the Trump administration, and a guy named Steve Bannon, who everybody I think knows from Breitbart and was in the White House for a while, we all have the same degree from the same institution, just a few years apart. So they all have the same national security studies degree that I have. So I'm sure there's a conspiracy theory in there somewhere. I just don't know what it would be.
And so was there anything that surprised you when you did this degree? Any sort of revelations about how America deals with their national security that was something that you hadn't expected, or had you been working for the government so long at this point that nothing was a surprise?
Yeah, I think the main thing I got out of the degree is, well, first off, to get the degree, I read literally, I actually kept track of it. I read 20,000 pages of articles, books, text in 2 years, which is a lot. And as my old professor said, it's only a lot of reading if you do it. And I did. So what did I get out of it is that I knew all of these things from a I've been I had had a career for 15, 20 years at that point. Not 20 years. Like I had been in that business for about a dozen years at that point. But I had to read all of the classic articles that establish, George Kennan, and I read all the classic pieces of national security thinking, and so by reading all that, it kind of gave me the sort of the classical background on this topic, if it were. So although I knew a lot of this stuff, until you've read the 20,000 pages, you just don't, now I really know, whatever, so it's like reading all the ancient books of ancient history, and you get the classical background in Latin or whatever it is. I got that in national security study. So it was very useful to me. And it also opened up all of the teaching opportunities that I couldn't have had before, because you can't be an adjunct professor without a master's degree. So it actually created, it's had, although it was incredibly painful, and I think the biggest thing I learned from getting a master's degree was that my wife is a wonderful person. She didn't leave me. When you're a father with 2 kids with a full schedule in soccer and, ballet and all this stuff, and you're juggling that with a full-time job and going to school at night, and your wife doesn't leave you, she's a wonderful person. That's my learning from the master's degree.
So your next game is Pericles. And so we go from a very modern war to ancient times. How different is it designing a game set in classical times as compared to modern warfare? Okay,
so, well, first off, it depends on what you're doing. I mean, obviously, if you're doing, I did with Richard Berg, I did a game called Hoplite, where you've got like regiments and units of hoplites bashing into each other. That's a battle game. A hoplite battle game looks nothing like a tank battle in France, obviously. So even understanding what's going on there, but interestingly, when you go to the strategic level, things get very similar. Because, one of the things I found, and this is almost counterintuitive, everybody loves tactical games, right? And I will submit that tactical games on a board, not on the ones you get on a computer, a tactical game on a board is the worst simulation of combat at that level that you can get, because it's like chess. You can see the pieces, it's nothing like it. But when you get to the strategic level, like if you're playing like Churchill or Pericles or whatever, have you ever been to Churchill's bunker in World War II bunker?
I confess I haven't, no.
go to London in the near future and you get get an hour free, you need to do this. But Churchill ran a war, as did FDR and Stalin, sitting in a small room with maps on a wall. Although Churchill, unlike FDR, I mean, when the Blitz was going on, I guess the room would shake and dust would come down from the ceiling in the classic way. But fundamentally, Churchill was isolated from the war in that he was sitting down in his bunker and Stalin was doing the same thing, etc. And so when you're playing a war game, that is a closer simulation to what they were experiencing because they're not dealing with real control. They're dealing with maps and counters and pins and all that. So in a lot of ways, a strategic game is is a good simulation of history because you're actually in the role of a guy sitting in a chair looking at a war as an abstract feature on a wall, not with real guys doing things like in a tactical game where it doesn't make any sense. So I'd start with that. Now, Pericles is really what I've become fascinated with, and it really is a function of what I did in government, working for the government, is I really got to see the connection between political policy and the military. The military is the blunt object of political policy, as Clausewitz would have said. And if you don't see the politics that's driving the war, you're really missing the main note of the main melody of the story. And so Pericles is really about, and when I did a earlier game called the Peloponnesian War, I focused on the strategic level, but I focused on the military piece. And what I couldn't do at that time was I couldn't experience the speeches that led to the campaigns that are in the game. And so what I did with Pericles is you actually get to experience the policy-making side of the war, and then you get to execute the policy, which is really what I find that really interests me a lot. And at that level, at the end of the day, at a strategic level, you got to build forces, you got to maintain forces, you got to send forces into battle. And so in a lot of ways, a strategic ancient game, although it has its own particular, the characteristics of the period and what you can and can't do, you don't have satellites and planes and all that. But if you take away the technology piece, at the strategic level, Pericles is a strategic level game about a war between two coalitions, which not unlike World War I or World War II in a lot of ways. So I find it fascinating that aspect of it is what I really enjoy. So I guess the long and the short of your question is, there are certainly features of an ancient game that are unique, but but the level, I think, drives the level at which you look at the game. A political military game about ancient warfare has a lot more in common with a political military game about the Napoleonic Wars or World War II than it does with a tactical game of the period. There's more similarities there than you would think.
So sort of since the Age of Reason, warfare has been documented and analysed. How much do we know about ancient Greek warfare, and to what degree are you confident of the verisimilitude of it when you design a game like that?
Well, that's a fair question, and I would say that as you walk away from the battle side of it, the verisimilitude gets better. So what we don't really understand is, and again, there's guys like Victor Hansen who have written some really good thinking. There's been a lot of what I call scientific archaeology, where they get guys on horses with bows and see what's possible and all this kind of stuff. They build a trebuchet and they put a hole through a wall. So there's a lot of things we discover from what they call this, build it and try it out kind of stuff, which is really interesting. But at the end of the day, there are gaps, and I'll give you a good example. So the Battle of Marathon is a very classic, for those of your, the Athenians have really made the Persians mad by burning down one of their regional capitals. They took that as, that was a little bit of an insult to the large empire, and they came after them with an expedition. And there are books and books and books written about the Battle of Marathon. But when I did the game for Hoplite, it's in the game when I did with Richard Berg, I actually typed everything known about the battle, 3 paragraphs out of Herodotus. That's all the data we have on that battle. And one of the key features of the description is that the Greeks do a 7 stadia, which is like they run for like almost a mile at the Persians in heavy armor. There are legions of books that tell you that's not possible, this didn't happen, blah, blah, blah. And the answer I go back to is, it's the only thing in the story that they write about, because it was unique. They wrote it, when you write a story, if everybody knows about something, like if I was telling you about a trip I took in a car, I don't tell you how to drive a car, I tell you about my trip. I don't tell you about a hoplite battle because you've been in one, so why would I tell you about what you already know? I'm going to tell you the unique feature. And guess what? In this crazy battle, we ran at them. So I believe that you have to think through these things from the perspective of why did they write this down and not something else down. And so the idea that you can do a battle of marathon without some kind of guys running at people in heavy armor, I think you're just making, now you're making stuff up. So to prove my point, I literally retyped by hand the 3 paragraphs. I said, here it all is. You make any decision you want about it. Now, people have written books and archaeology, supported some of this stuff, but the bottom line is we don't really know much about an ancient battle is really the bottom line. However, what we do know when you get to the strategic levels, we actually have at least reasonable. We don't have obviously recordings of what Pericles said said in the funeral oration. We only have what Thucydides wrote about it, what he said. So, but because the book survived for so long, the people at the time, if they thought it was nonsense, they wouldn't have read it. And remember, they had to make copies, right? Remember when this book it's not a book first off, it's a bunch of scrolls, and the scrolls would not have been hand copied into other copies if there wasn't something to it that rang true to the people of the time. And there had to be enough copies to survive into the Middle Ages so that the monks could copy it to make it a book. So you have to sort of go by this probability of, there had to be enough copies, it had to be popular enough and accurate enough for it to exist in enough quantity so one copy would make it into the modern era, 2,500 years ago. So if we take all that into account, we know pretty much what they were thinking about strategically. We know about their governmental structure. We know about the tribute list because they actually etched it into stone. So we actually have the stone tablets say how much money everybody paid. So we have the economics of this thing. We know what it costs to operate a trireme. We knew, we have a lot of data that's demographic and strategic and the basic economics of the situation. We actually had some pretty good information on that. So as a consequence, a strategic level game has got a lot of good data behind it. Forgetting about what the battle's about. When you do a game at a strategic level, forces get together, you roll some dice, guys die, somebody wins, somebody loses. At that point, the abstraction is good enough to handle as long as the outcomes capture the kind of outcomes they got, you're good. You don't have to get into the detail where you don't know anything that's going on. So by losing detail, you get a better simulation at the strategic level than you could have at the tactical level. If that makes general sense. I kind of rambled a little bit there, but that's the point. So I really like Pericles. It's got to go to the cabin.
So I want to talk about war games in general, because I'm not a war gamer. I have friends who are, and we have a constant debate about what defines a war game. And my favourite game is Lewis and Clark. Yeah, I adore some games just click. You know how to play them, and you know how to manipulate the systems, and they just work for you. And that one really, from the first moment I played it, I fell in love with it. But, what do you think is the purpose of a war game? Are they supposed to be recreation? Are they supposed to be education? Is that a fatuous distinction?
Something, what I've learned is everybody comes at everything for different reasons. I think so. I think all of the above is true. And for some people, none of the above is true. So I think that people who play war games like I think at their core, they like the topic and the history. It's the history thing. And, I'm a professional historian, and every so often especially when I'm at Columbia University, the Columbia University history department is very anti-war. And to me, given that more than half of history is conflict, to teach history without the conflict part is like, I don't know, it's like having a 7-course dinner where everything is just a piece of bread. You left that almost all the detail just because you have this aversion to conflict. Okay, that's fine. So from a historical professional point of view, I think that any department that just tries to ignore more than half of history is really kind of missing the boat. It's just as a general rule. So for me, I enjoy really the history, and I particularly like more strategy, political, military. That's the kind of things I really am interested in. I'm less interested in, moving the 50 caliber machine gun from this house to that house so I can shoot some more people. I play games like that. They're fun to play, good interaction, but that's less interesting to me than having a debate in the forum about policy and how that's going to affect a conflict and the economics and all that. So that's kind of why I like it. I think that some people enjoy, I know a lot of people found chess to be a little bit too limiting, and they got into they like strategy games. They like the strategy, the give and take, and a lot of I think if I think about the biggest dividing line between what everybody likes to put a label like what a Eurogamer likes and what a wargamer likes, I find Eurogamers as a general, every time you make a general rule, it's going to be false. But let me just make a false impression about Eurogamers. Is most of the games I play like that, there is little to no direct, I'm doing something bad to you. I might hurt you by, I like this game of Agricola. I don't know if you've ever played Agricola.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like that. I mean, you're building a farm, right? So there's no, my cow runs down your cow kind of thing, or I eat your grain. But what there is in the game is, by my taking an action that means you can't take that action, that's about the most violent thing I can do to you in a game of Agricola. I'm going to build fences this turn, you can't build fences, which might hurt your strategy. But I can't, knock your fences down. That's kind of how I look at it. That's fine. But when you play, if you're a chess player, I mean, there's no purpose to chess other than to win the game. I mean, there's some beautiful artistry in the moves, but ultimately it's about winning. And so it's more of that, do you like that head-to-head competition where I succeed and you fail versus we want to play a game where it's about trying to produce the best economy or engine or situation for myself. If you like Lewis and Clark, you like that notion of discovery and making sure I have enough food so I don't die and working with the locals and all that. That's another kind of, there's a million different kinds of games. So I think that to me is the main distinction that kind of separates wargamers. Now, when Tom Vassell did a list of, he called them war games, and the games that he picked, there was maybe of their top 10s for all of them, there was one game out of 30 games that I would have said was a war game. But I accepted that they were conflict games. If you do a game on Star Wars, it's not a war game per se, but it's a conflict game. I mean, you're blowing up, the Death Star or whatever the heck is going on. So there's a lot of games that are conflict games that are not necessarily war games because there's conflict is built into the game. So it depends on how much of a distinction you want to make.
And so are war games ways of reminding us of the brutality and futility of war? Or are they more primers on how to execute them successfully?
I think that for me, it's a little bit of both. I mean, I'll tell you something interesting. So I think it's later in this thing, but what I did for a living was I ran war games in the Pentagon. That's what I did. And I will tell you that one of the hardest things to get military officers to do is start a war. They'll fight a war, but to start a war, that you almost have to start the game with the war already on, otherwise they won't do it. So when people think that you're in the military, you're a warmonger, is actually because they understand it, they don't want to do it. So I would offer that as a wargamer. Wargamers are probably the people who are least likely to want to go to war because they actually understand what that means. When you don't really understand what it means, you think, oh yeah, that might be a good idea. And the answer is it's never a good idea. So I would say that understanding the military history actually makes me I'm much more willing to see a diplomatic solution that is not exactly what I want versus trying to fight a war to get what I want. Because you never get what you want out of a war, other than a lot of people get killed. So I would say war gamers are actually more anti-war because they understand it. But the reason that I play war games, I really enjoy I play a lot of war games solitaire. By the way, this still holds true. More than half of all war games are played by the person playing against themselves, because they're really trying to see the options in the history of the book they did. When you read a book about it, they're going to tell you what happened. The war games are about alternate histories and alternate paths, and that's really I find the fascination in war games.
And so I guess the fascination lies in the counterfactual.
Yes, because if you're going to play a war game that all the war game does is script out the exact war, I'd just read a book. So what's the point of playing a game if And just so you know, most wars, in hindsight, one side had the edge. It just they didn't, because they got to it into the war because of passion in many cases, or an insult, or revanchism, or you name it. The war happened, but in hindsight, it was clear why it came out the way it did was more likely than not is often the case. So again, it goes back to this: you want to experience what was possible. So Pericles, to give the one we were just talking about, is what I call a sandbox design. And what I mean by a sandbox is, if you take the metaphor, you can build a castle one way or another way, or you can mold the sandcastle to a different storyline. So Pericles is designed to, included within the Pericles universe, is the historical story. But there's all these other branches and sequels that are not in the historical story that are plausible and could have happened. And so you get to manipulate. So in the game, you don't have to go to war. You can just fight out a nasty peace. You can fight a big war right from the. You can do whatever you want. You can make. And by the way, one of the hardest things in Pericles, which I really worked hard at, if you want to recreate the period, you have to go to war, go to peace, go to war a second time, and then have it end. And most games don't have. Most games, like the beginning of the game is the war, and when you win the war, it's over. Pericles actually cycles through peace and war as part of the strategy, as you would in real life. So you can fight an entire game of Pericles out and never go to war, technically.
So your next game is Manassas, and you mentioned it earlier. And do you find yourself drawn to specifically American conflicts? And this one is set in the Civil War.
Yeah, well, you'll see in my next one. I also am very fascinated by. So, as a guy who came up in the war game, when you come up in the war game business, all the early war games that I played as a kid were always about a big battle, right? It was Battle of the Bulge, it was Gettysburg, and so battle games were always sort of the stock and trade of when I was a kid, and these are the games I played. So battles, although they tend to be tactical, but the idea of these famous battles is a lot of war games are done around these things, and so Manassas is like so if I think about a game, so when you gave me the option to make 5 games, I kind of thought more about topic. So I wanted a game on the Pacific War. Good, got that. That was Pacific. I need to have an Ancients game. My favorite Ancients game is Pericles. Others would pick another one. So I had an Ancient strategic game. Then I wanted to have an American Civil War battle game. And my favorite is Manassas, but it could have, I played a lot. I have a lot of other favorite or near favorite like games on Gettysburg. I used to be on the foundation of the Gettysburg Foundation. I opened up a museum, by the way. So I've been to the Gettysburg battlefield, 100 times. I mean, that's realistically because I used to go up there for meetings and I, work with So I've been I know Gettysburg like the back of my hand. And if I had to pick a second Civil War game, it would have been a Gettysburg game. But it just so happens that this Manassas game is just one of those games that Rick did it. Rick Britton, I think is his name, right? And it's just one of those games that just totally thematically just feels. It's just it's like putting on an old pair of shoes. I just like playing that game. It's just one of those games. It's great fun.
And so, how much of a role do you think the Civil War has in the formation of modern America? Because America at the moment seems very divided. Do you think that the Civil War fed in directly to the modern day division?
I gotta tell you, there is it's not history repeating itself, but you have to understand. So when I see the news, and you have what I call, pro-administration news stations and anti-administration news stations. Well, the period of the Civil War, just go look at Lincoln does his Gettysburg Address, right? And they were pro-administration newspapers, brilliant. The president was brilliant. The president did amazing things. Then there was anti-administration. They said, the president got up and spoke for 2 minutes. What the heck was going on there? And he said nothing, and it was an embarrassment to the country. And those voices that I hear on, the news stations were exactly played out during the Civil War, during the war. Every time I hear the word that everybody on the news should lose is the word unprecedented. There is so much precedence for what they're talking about, they don't even understand what they're talking about. But the word unprecedented is like, just, I laugh. But So the Civil War, and then of course the racial issues have still not been resolved, and I find that to be, just horrible. And by the way, one of the greatest weaknesses of the American system is sectionalism. That it's built into the. See, when we started when they wrote the Constitution, there were 13 colonies, and even then, the North to South, there were sectional issues that became a problem. And as the country expanded, those sectional issues didn't go away; they became exacerbated. We still haven't gotten away from that. So when you see what's going on in America today, in a lot of ways, these are foundational issues that go back to certainly to the American Civil War and even before how we wrote our documents. And so it's not unprecedented. It's just we wax and wane from these periods, and right now we're in a particularly intense one. But we've had them before, and this is just it's more noticeable because everything you say is immediately commented on in social media in about 8 seconds. So there's voices yelling and screaming, and then there's people pumping in stuff that's just make-believe so they can make money for clicks, and who the heck knows what's going on. But the bottom line is that, no, I think the American Civil War is one we should study more, not less.
So going on then, so you said you played games at the Pentagon as a job.
I ran exercises to look at problems and start to understand how we would resolve them in a better way than, the best way possible.
And so what was your job responsibility, and what kind of people were you working with?
Okay, so just to be clear, I wrote a book about this called Wargaming for Leaders. I think it's in my bio somewhere. And so anything I say here has already been published, and I got there'll be areas where I won't go, but essentially there's an issue, whatever it is, and usually it's it's something everything that you read in the newspaper, somebody has prior to that looked at it in some detail through a war game process with teams interacting over the issue and seeing what the issues really are. Okay, so that happens all the time. And there's nothing that goes on in the paper that is not examined and analyzed. It was probably analyzed 2 years ago, and it gets updated. So my job was to organize, build all the background information, and actually run an exercise. And the people that would be in it would be people from the Pentagon and the State Department.
And so what was the purpose to have? So I was reading your bio, and you talked about how things that you did were implemented during the First Gulf War.
So this is in the book. It's I want to say it's August 2nd of 1990, and I get into the Washington Metro, and it's like 6:30 in the morning, and somebody across from me opens their paper, and I see the headline. I hadn't even looked at the news, and it's too early. I'm barely awake yet, and it says Iraq invades Kuwait is on the front page. I get into my office, and the phone's already ringing, and they want me to come down to the Pentagon to see if I can put something together immediately, because the U.S. doesn't know what they're going to do. And so for the next 24 hours, I organize and put together, and we look at what are the danger spots, and how should the U.S. respond to this in case they keep going on into Saudi Arabia, because the eastern province of Saudi Arabia is where all the oil is. And Saddam Hussein had oil, and he had been fighting a long war with Iran over oil, and now he's got Kuwait with its oil. And if he gets the rest of the oil, what's going to happen to the world? And U.S., we need the oil, right? It's all about the black gold. So we ran a war game: is what should the United States' initial response be to this crisis? And that was delivered to the Pentagon the next morning of options open to the Secretary of Defense and the President. That's what happens. And the people who played in the game, one woman who played in the game actually knew Saddam Hussein. So we have people, these are not just like, oh, let's see if we can get the grocery clerk from the corner to come down and play a game. No, we had people who knew the topic. You get these experts in, and they start to say, well, here are your choices. And we look through, well, if we do this choice, what happens? If we do this choice, what might happen? So you're not just throwing out ideas, but you're stress testing those ideas a little bit to say, what are these choices? And obviously the main choice is, how do we get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait? How do we stop Saddam Hussein from taking the rest of the oil? These are the questions we were asking, and these are the choices we had.
And so these sort of events, sort of history of American conflict from the 90s, when you were working, Booz Allen Hamilton, were you sort of, okay, this is a potential hotspot, we should look into this, so if the government call, we'll be prepared? Or was it in this sense just, something would happen and you would react to it?
Two ways. One would be what you just said, the reaction thing. And then the other thing is, I worked out of the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Staff for most of my career, so I knew, they knew me. I knew them. I mean, this is where I spent my days, So they would say there's a part of the Joint Staff. I don't want to bore the heck out of your listeners, but there's a part of the Joint Staff called the J8, and the J8's job is to look at these things. And so I worked with them, and they would say, okay, this week we're going to look at this, and this week we're going to look at that, and so on and so forth. And then every so often something really hot would happen, and we'd go look at that immediately and drop everything else. And so there was this is a part of what happens inside the building.
And is it true about the stories you hear that Kissinger would play diplomacy with the president in the Oval Office? And I know that's before your time, but was that sort of spirit of that evident around the sort of American administration?
I'm going to be careful here. First off, I've never had a president of the United States in the room with me, so I want to be clear about that. But I have been beyond that, I've been with the most senior people you can imagine. You don't always want the decision maker in the game because you don't want anybody to know what they would do, but they watch. They watch. Oh, it's like they're sitting there watching what's happening, seeing the discussion, but we don't want them to reveal what they would do because that's not a good idea. So, but they would see and read and understand the options. What is the art of the possible here is what you do want. And we've had some very senior people looking at things like that. But to give a less military example, one of the things so they remember the financial crisis in 2008, and there's been others. We had this, the Secretary of the Treasury in a simulation, but the Secretary of the Treasury did not participate in the exercise. He watched what they did in the exercise. And we had every top banker and, financial guy in the United States who runs all the banks were in the room. But he set it off, but he didn't participate. But he got to see what they thought were having him hear from the experts what they think are the problems is a very informative thing for him to hear.
And did you find that different administrations had different attitudes to you and your works? Was some more receptive, some more reticent, or was it just it's a standard part of government that these things happen?
So one part of it was standard. Like the military is administration agnostic, so they have to do their job. They have a job to do regardless of who's in charge, right? Administration-wise, yes. So one of the big things that happens, depending on, again, the character of the White House, is there's this concept in national security called what is a fundamentally governmental function, okay? And you can divide, and every administration defines that either very narrowly or very broadly. So, for instance, the Obama administration had a very broad definition of what was inherently governmental function, and so they did not like using non-government employees for anything. Now, what would happen is because the governmental employees don't have the expertise, I would be brought in to set it all up, but I couldn't run it. They didn't want me in the room when they actually did it. The Bush the second Bush 43 administration had a very much narrower definition of what was inherently governmental, and they were very happy to use, a broader set of expertise, which I think, by the way, I would offer that, the idea that if you're not a government employee, there's something wrong with you. 90% of the people who work for me in these situations used to be like generals and admirals and colonels. And so the idea that because they stopped being in the military, all of a sudden they became some kind of different person is kind of ludicrous. They're the same person they were. So I have to say that I believe that the broad definition of what is inherently governmental just denies the government a lot of expertise and background people for no particular reason that I can understand. But the Obama administration was particularly the idea of leaking. They were worried about leaking, and the leaks happened anyway. So it's just again. But every administration has that issue. But the military has a job to do 24/7 every day. So there is a more standard process.
So you worked for Bose Allen Hamilton, and so they became sort of quite famous a few years ago, and this was after your time. Yeah, when one of their employees leaked a lot of information, and of course this was Edward Snowden. What was your opinion when you saw that?
Well, first off, and I want to say that the good news is Edward Snowden did not directly work for me, so I want to say that right up front. Although if it had been 2 years earlier, he might have, because I used to run that office in Hawaii. He's a spy. I mean, I just want to just sort of, he is and was a spy who was manipulated by maybe the Russians, maybe the Chinese, maybe both. And what he did was very damaging to the United States of America. End of story. The true story is, as best I can, and again, I got this third hand, so, I don't even know if it's even 100% accurate, but he started working for us at the behest of the government. The government wanted him to work for somebody. Had found him. He's very, by the way, a lot of things that are untrue about him. They always said he didn't have a college degree. He had plenty of credit. He had enough credits for a college degree, but when whoever interviewed him for the job, it was a system administrator. The guy or gal, I don't remember who did it, who was brought in, did not have the expertise to actually interview him. And we had to bring him back to be interviewed by one of our experts. That's how he's a very bright guy. So from a technical point of view, this guy is very, very good. And this is why I think that, and he would somehow got himself this job. It just happened that we were the holder of the contract, but he was working on a government facility, working for government people. That's why we didn't get in any real trouble. He wasn't under our direct supervision anyway, and he basically was there for 10 days, stole everything he wanted to steal, and then all of a sudden, just like any employee that we didn't really know, like 23,000 employees, he went on sick leave. That happens all the time. People get sick and they go on sick leave. And then a month later, he shows up in The Guardian, and the whole thing breaks. And they said to us, "Who's this guy?" We didn't even know who he was. I mean, he was just an employee who had signed all the, given all the proper ethics training that he obviously violated every piece of, and and he violated everything that the government did the background checks on him. So that wasn't us. The government does all that, and so he slipped through the government ring, and we just happened to be holding the contract, but. He's a traitor, and he's a spy, and I think nothing good of him. And by the way, just so you know, at some point, Putin is going to want something, and he'll spend the rest of his life in an American prison someday. It could be 10 years from now, but at some point, the Russians are going to want something from us, and he's just one of the pawns. Here's a pawn. He's one of the pawns that's going to get traded back to us for something they want, and he'll go to jail. So that's just a matter of time.
And so regardless of whether you think what the government the information the government were collecting was correct or not, you do believe Edward Snowden was acting, what he says about liberty and things like that is not sincere, that he's working for another power.
Yes, I believe that he is an agent of another power, and that is just a really good cover story that he gets to play.
So, going on, you've given me a game. Now I have to try and pronounce a foreign language. So your next game is Original Le Bataille de la Moskova. Why are you taking this one to the cabin?
All right, well, this one's... So I go to my first Origins, and I've got $35. Remember, this for me, I had saved up $35 to buy a game. I was going to buy games. For $35, I would probably be able to get normally 5 or 6 games in that period of time. So I got my $35. I'm going to get 5 or 6 new games. Very excited. I'm in the hall for all of about 6 minutes, and I see this table with these 4 maps and of the Battle of Borodina. And there's this guy named Larry Groves who designed, or one of the original designers of the system. And it's this, grand tactical battle of Borodina between Napoleon and Kutuzov, during the 1812 campaign. And it's $35. And so within 5 minutes, my budget goes from $35 to zero as I buy this copy of this game. I'm so enthralled. And so I got it. I'm playing in various games. And then Larry finds me, I guess, later that afternoon. He goes, look, I don't think people, because it's $35. It was probably one of the most expensive games in the hall because everything's more like about $7 or $10. And so he's not selling a lot of games. He says, I want to set up a game. I want you to play with me and a bunch of other guys, and we're just going to play for the rest of the weekend. So I spend the rest of the Origins in a small room in Baltimore, and I play the Battle of Borodino for 48 hours. And then, of course, word gets around that these crazy guys in the back room are playing this big game. People come by, and all of a sudden his sales go up because people, it looks really cool. And so I got to play this game, and so it became so. And then my friend, a good friend of mine, Gary Gonzalez, and I, we've had multiple sessions of playing this game. So it's a big, grand tactical Napoleonic game with artillery and cavalry charges and all this cool stuff. And it's just sort of like, if I'm going to be stuck in this cabin while the world's coming to an end, I figure I better have a nice long game to play while I'm in there. so this is okay, we can play this game for 2 weeks game.
And so this is a hex and counter game. How important is that mechanism to war games? Is it the core of war games?
Well, first off, there is only a few ways that you can tile a surface. Okay, you can use hexagons, triangles, squares, and rectangles. If you're really clever, you can use rhomboids and parallelograms, but you get the basic idea. You got to have certain shapes to make a tiled surface. The advantage, and so hexagons. In fact, the first war games that Charles Roberts did, in fact, the original Gettysburg from Avalon Hill uses the the brickwork approach where you have rectangles built like a brick, like two and there's one here, and so you get this. So the brickwork pattern is the same thing as a hexagon because you can go off 6 ways out of the space, right? So the hexagon was used back in 60, 61, and it just was a convenient shape that defined a mechanic. But the big advantage of why you want a regular tiled surface is when you're doing a battle game, movement and range and all that stuff is easy to count. The reason I use hexagon, when I had the card-driven game when I did We the People, it's a network, it's a box and line, network kind of game where you go from space to space by connected lines. A lot of Euro games use that technique. Mm-hmm. When I did Empire of the Sun, the reason I went back to hexagons is one of the biggest issues in the Pacific War, which a lot of games ignore because they want to go to areas and make it look more friendly, is planes only fly a certain distance and ships have certain ranges. And so airplane ranges is much easier to handle in a hexagon. It goes 3 spaces. I don't have to go, well, you're in this area and you can go to the adjacent area, but you can't go to 2 adjacent. You have to write all these crazy rules to get around the fact that you won't use hexagons. But if you use a hexagon, you can count to 3. So it just solves a host of problems on distance and kinetics. So the hexagon piece defines war games because distance and range and the kinetics of battle is more easily, you lose a lot of problems by just using this simple technique of geometry. And it just makes life easy.
So you retired from the corporate world, from working at the Pentagon, and then you opened Studio Designs, which is there to develop games and sells, some of your most famous games, Churchill, Empire of the Sun. So why did you, at the time when you were retiring, decide to embark on this unsure thing of having your own game company?
Well, I'll answer that question. I'll give you a broader perspective after. So first off, the reason that you have a company when you have what they call passive income from royalties from games is taxes. It's much more. It's a much more in the United States tax system. It's a much more efficient way to treat expenses and costs and all that kind of stuff. That's why you have a company. So if I want to buy if I go to a distributor and I want to buy counter trays, I can either pay $5 a counter tray or I can pay $1 a counter tray. But to pay $1 a counter tray, I have to be a company with a tax ID. Not a problem. So there's a lot of financial expense, tax benefits for a company. It doesn't change what I'm doing. Now, in the United States, because you have a more international audience, there's something called a W-2. So if I work for, a company and I, get a salary, I get, at the end of the year, I get something called a W-2. It's a tax form. It says, here's how much money you were paid. Here's how much money you've already paid in taxes. And you go to your accountant and they figure out, what the rest of the bill is, or you get money back and all that kind of nonsense. The other thing could be is you're an independent, you get something called a 1099. That means that I'm working for GMT Games. They pay me royalty money. At the end of the year, GMT gives me a 1099 and says, here's how much money we gave Mark Herman in royalties. That gets reported to the government, and I got to go give the government taxes, okay? So what I did when I retired, I didn't really retire from anything. I stopped being an employee getting a W-2, and I became a proprietor getting 1099s. So I have multiple, and I do what I call assemble a salary. So I work for Columbia University, they pay me some money. I work as a game designer, and various companies pay me some money. I have a analytics company that I do work for a client, and they pay me some money. So everybody's paying me some money, and I put it all together, and I can eat and pay my rent and all that good stuff. But so I moved to what I call a 1099 existence. I'm just an independent doing multiple lines of business, which is a lot of fun.
So I'm going to ask you a question, and it's a very mean one. But of all the games you've designed, which one would you say you're most proud of?
Most proud of? I guess, Empire of the Sun is probably the one I'm most proud of. I think that's fair to say. That's why I'm taking it to the cabin.
And why?
Why do you like to play Lewis and Clark? I just like playing the game. I know how it works, and because of the cards, there's literally a trillion different combinations of situations that can occur over the course of the game. Obviously, I'm not going to live long enough to play a trillion of anything. So the game is always fresh. The narrative that the game generates is always a little bit, even for somebody who's played it now, I don't even know how. I long ago lost track of how many times I played Empire of the Sun, and every time I play it, it's like, oh, I've never seen that before, so it's still surprising me in its own way, which I like.
And so, what impact do you think you've had on the world of gaming? And what is your legacy to the world of gaming?
By the way, you couldn't hear it, but when you asked that question, my wife is on the other side of the door and she giggled. I heard her on my other. You didn't hear it on the. I got to be honest with you. That is, as a historian, what you can't do is decide what your impact on anything was. So it's for others to decide. But I will say that what I have, wargaming, being a game designer, because I have designed some games that, I have a new game coming out. It's an abstract strategy game from Hollandspiel which I've been selling, called Ribbit, which is, it has nothing to do with it's a, like a chess game, it's like checkers. So I design games. I've done science fiction. I've done a lot of, and I'm doing more different things, but I have just really enjoyed the fact that people want to play my games. I mean, I'm just humbled by that idea that they want to play my games. I enjoy making them. It's a perfect circle, right? And so I will continue doing that till I can't. And as I always tell people, I support my games very heavily. So anybody writes me, I always answer their questions. I mean, without, I respond, these are the people I like to interact with. So I don't know what impact I've had on them, but the impact they've had on me is they've made me very happy. And they've been very nice to me. Even the ones that yell at me, I find to be more amusing than not. The nerd rage part I find to be of interest, but I don't take it badly. So it's just the way it is. But I think that the impact of the audience on me has been very positive. It's given me a very fun life. I've given me almost all my friends come from it. So I like to think more of what it's done for me than what I've done for them. They'll have to figure out. But it's been a great experience. It continues to be.
So your final game is one that looks over the span of the American Civil War, and that's For the People. What goes into making a game that stretches over such a huge, complex conflict like this?
Well, I got to tell you, going back to the beginning of this thing, the Civil War has been sort of the formative, that 1960s centennial, that was like sort of the core of how this all began for me. And so I I've never met a Civil War game I didn't like at some level. Just like playing them. But when I did For the People, I really wanted to do a game that focused on this psychological history. The thing that I felt that all the other Civil War games wasn't doing for me was what I described earlier, that, I didn't think I was Lincoln. I was a military commander. They were military games. And For the People is really a political military game. In other words, you're Lincoln or Davis the president, not McClellan the general. You're not the general running the war, you're the politician running the war. And so there's a common theme here with Pericles, is that I'm fascinated by this, the president's got more things to do than just run a war. And so you've got some political things. And I ran that game. There was a really cool idea in this book called How the North Won by Hathaway and Jones. And in there they had this interesting graph, but I got this idea of strategic will. And so the war is not about battles per se. It's not about anything. It's about, can I keep my side in the war? And if I perform badly, my side says, this is not going well, we need to stop. And so this idea of that who's got the will to take it through to the end to win is really the struggle, and it's really a political struggle, but through a military mechanic, obviously. But there's a lot of, the cards allow me to bring all these politics and, more interesting narrative. And again, I would come back to the thing that, reason I play any game, by the way, even a Euro game or anything, is let's just talk about Agricola. Agricola's got this great narrative that I feel like I'm growing a family on a farm. There's a great narrative there, and you like Lewis and Clark because there's this great narrative of discovery of the Louisiana Purchase, and I like Empire of the Sun because I feel like the generals running the war, but with the president and the joint staff over my head, giving me directions through the cards of what I can and do, how much logistics I get, and I got to sort of solve that puzzle about how to get there. And I tell that story. And For the People tells the story of being, Lincoln or Davis trying to prevail in an internal civil war.
So you're driving to the cabin, and you've got your foot down because you're fleeing the apocalypse, and your car skids around a corner. The back door flies open. 4 of the games fly out of the car, down a ravine, into a river, and are swept away. Which game do you hope is still lying on the back seat of the car?
As long as there's no humans involved in this going out the door thing. That's an interesting question. If I only had one to play, I'd have to say Empire of the Sun. It's the one I would hope that was still in the backseat. But I would be okay if any one of the 5 was back there. And remember also, I snuck a small chess set into my pocket, so that survived no matter what.
So if people want to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
Oh, that's great. I mean, I'm on Board Game Geek, and I have an account there, so you can always. I get the what they call geek mail all the time. So please feel free. And then I'm on the various boards, so people, there's all sorts of threads where I post something or I post and people respond to me. So, I mean, I spend lots of time corresponding. You and I have been corresponding. And, people get a hold of me. But BGG is a good way to start a conversation because I always see the BGG mail and all that.
Great. Mark Herman, thank you very much.
Ben, I want to compliment you. These are some of the more interesting questions I've been asked in a long time.
And if you wanted to say something nice about the show, or if you wanted to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter. You could send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You could support the show at patreon.com/5G4D. And if I haven't had to flee from the terrifying Tory power stances and the bowdlerized versions of classic novels, I'll see you in 2 weeks' time for another 5 Games for Doomsday.